Thanks so much for having me. Good evening from New York City. My name is Martin WAEHLISCH. I work in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and in the UN Secretariat, I lead a team that is tasked with bringing in new technologies and methods to the work of conflict prevention, peacemaking, and peace building. And let me also say that I'm thankful for being invited to speak to you, but I'm also sad that I didn't have the chance to actually come to Japan. I feel we live in this world of digital communication, while it is even more important to actually meet in person and get together after those years and living through the pandemic. Now, before I start, I wanted to make a confession. I'm not a computer engineer. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a lawyer by profession, but I'm equally a tech enthusiast, and I'm certainly also a science fiction consumer at night. My past in the UN has brought me to places like the Middle East. I've worked in Yemen and Lebanon. I've worked on the conflict in Afghanistan, Kosovo, many other places. And I've been fascinated over the last decade or so by the affordances of new technologies and innovation to help bring forward the UN's peace agenda. Now, when we think about the United Nations, on one side, we have in mind the new affordances of new technologies, and we want to apply artificial intelligence, big data mining, large language models to the context of peace. But at the same time, you will find places in the UN Secretariat, like the one you see on the picture on the left, a card that says UN Docs, where you find papers on that people push to conference rooms. So while this organization tries to live up to the spirit of the 21st century and the affordances of the fourth industrial revolution, we are still pretty much struggling with the challenges of a large bureaucracy and the limitations that we have as an international organization. Now, the question is, why does innovation matter? And we have to realize that we live in a time where we see new conflict challenges, new conflict realities. Think about the dark side of the digital world, which we call the Wide Web, but also issues related to mis and disinformation that have certainly changed the way of how conflicts are carried out. It's not just between states anymore, but we've seen an influx, an increase of non-state actors that certainly play a role. The Ukraine was mentioned, and much of the conflict regarding the Ukraine is not carried out through formal negotiations, but pretty much as well on TikTok and other social media channels that influence the hearts and minds and influence the political discord as large. There are new challenges that are simply related to the existential climate crisis. We have seen an increase of migration caused by climate change more than by armed conflict. And that has also changed the way of how diplomacy can be carried out. And likewise, the pandemic has really taught us over the last years that although everybody desires a handshake, we have seen that digital communications has equally allowed the international community to communicate and build consensus beyond boundaries using modern ways of communication. And I think the sheer fact that I'm speaking to you from New York City at an evening, on those issues are kind of an example of that. I think 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had that conversation at ease as we have it nowadays. And all of that, those new conflict realities require us to think about new ways and means to address conflict. Now, the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has brought forward a range of initiatives over the last years, starting with a digital compact that brings the different private and public entities on digital issues together, culminating in the Common Agenda proposal last year. And that Common Agenda includes a proposal for the UN 2.0, and that entails 5 elements that are called the quintet issues, including data, issues related to innovation at large, strategic foresight, so ways of thinking about the future or the futures in plural in a more structured way, issues related to behavioral science, so how do we generate pro-social choice, learning from cognitive and brain sciences, in any ways that help us to better measure performance and end results. So this is kind of a chapeau of the UN 2.0, and you will see various activities coming from the UN system addressing those issues to bring the organization up to speed to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Now, in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, we cover innovation in a two-folded way. One is that we don't fetishize or glorify new technologies. As said, we live in this fourth industrial revolution, and I think it's impossible to think away new technologies, but we are addressing new technologies in a careful and in a responsible way. So we look, and it was mentioned just in the presentation before, at what is the problem at hand, what are the challenges we face before we sort out solutions that might include technical solutions. And the second dimension of this endeavor is really to make space for experimentation, for speculative approaches, and to allow ourselves failure, but also then to fall forward and learn from those failures. The UN has really ramped up its innovation capacities. We now have 67 innovation entities in the UN universe. That includes innovation entities among the agency pros and funds. So think about the World Food Program or the Refugee Agency or the Children's Fund. So all the different parts of the UN have now dedicated innovation capacities to address new practices and new ways of thinking. For us on the peace and security side, that ranges really from thinking about geospatial remote sensing. I'll give you a quick example on this in a second, as well as immersive storytelling. We just talked about the affordances of virtual reality, but a lot of the work we do spins around social media listening, ways of how we can engage with the public in a peace process, how we can mine large volume of text, given that diplomacy is mostly text or speech-based, and I can transcribe speech into text, and I can mine that to use the power of new technologies for sense-making. And then two non-tech related issues are equally relevant: structured thinking about the future, foresight, that includes anticipatory decision-making, as well as ways that are at the nexus of human machines that we call behavioral science interventions, where we think about how we can structure and engineer pro-social choice. Now, just as a quick footnote on geospatial work, as it was mentioned in the first presentation, we draw from the affordances of new tech. CubeSats were mentioned, small satellites, high cadence of imagery that we apply to detect water shortages in the Middle East, for instance, where we can basically triangulate various geospatial information drawn from open source Earth observation data sets that are environmental satellites, and then we basically triangulate that with past experience on armed conflict to predict water shortage. So a very concrete example where open source information are used to advance conflict prevention here in the context of water shortage in the Middle East. Second example, we just spoke about what it was of virtual reality or enhanced realities, XR at large. In January 2022, last year, we briefed the Security Council, first time in the chamber in virtual reality. That was on the context of Colombia. And this has been a recurrent now method in the council. We repeated this in July last year, and we're just looking at another session of the council, this time on Lebanon, using virtual realities and ways of creative storytelling. Again, this hasn't been new. We have always tried to find innovative methods of bringing in a TV screen into the council chamber or just a map. And this is really just an add-on to the different types of briefings the council receives. And that's not the future, that's actually the reality. We're building the metaverse for the United Nations and ways to use virtual spaces for confidential conversations. Now, I wanted to also highlight that this is not just for diplomats, but also certainly a tool that we are exploring for peace building, where we can do body swaps and ways to walk each other's journey. Here you see an example of how we are using VR in Colombia to give youth a feeling for what it's like to be in different parts of the country and hear the story of former FARC members or victim groups. And that's certainly an area that is still underexplored, scientifically speaking. If you think about different scientific studies that kind of contradict each other, it's not yet clear whether VR really increases empathy or lasting memory. Those are things that are literally just to be explored as we use them. So I'm going back to the point that I mentioned earlier. We are treating this in a very careful way to not rush into technical solutions without having it properly tested, and we address it from a responsible point of view. Now, let me zoom in on three things: social media listening, digital dialogue, where we use artificial intelligence, and then the future science fiction of how we use new imaginatives, just to broaden the perspective. Now, when we think about social media, a lot of the work that has helped us get a sense for political polarization is to map out topics and stances, aka sentiments, on different social media platforms. Here, take the example of Yemen, where we can map out how political conversations on social media might mirror social engagement on the ground. Yes, we are mindful that social media is used only by a fraction of the population, and likewise, we carry out studies to better understand how many people have access to the internet, how many people are on Facebook, on Twitter. In many places that we operate, social media is secondary. Radio and television is king. And we then use this as a way to either confirm biases that might exist when it comes to political analysis or fill in blind spots. So this is an additional signal for us for political analysis. It's not going to be the truth, whatever that means, but it's going to be an additional vector for conversation, additional vector for political analytical products that we produce. The same goes for cross-platform analysis. Take the example here of unpacking coordinated inauthentic behavior. So ways where we can get a sense for mis and disinformation, and that is cross-platform analysis to get a sense for, how conversations here on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube drive a certain narrative that might be true on the ground or just create noise to camouflage political intention. Or here another example from our social media work where we map out digital armies to get a sense for the quantity and quality of political followership. That gives us a sense for the emergence of new political actors, for instance, that have followership on social media, but not yet political alliances on the ground. Or they give us a sense for silence as well. I think when it comes to social media, it's equally important what we don't see, right? If we don't see certain things, that gives us also a signal for the suppression, for instance, of political participation, or think about the internet blackouts where the states turn off the internet. And that also tells us a lot about what's actually happening there. Maybe not in detail exactly kind of what the dynamics are, but that something is happening there. This has led to a range of applications that we produce in-house. Here an example of a Twitter monitoring tool that we built in the United Nations that gives bureaucrats, international officials, a quick snapshot of conversations on Twitter. And we continue this journey where we build open source applications that we have full control over, where we understand the source code and that we can modify to the needs and requirements of the organization in comparison to just buying solutions from the private market. We are focusing more on open source, internally built applications that are then again kind of objective and transparent and live up to the spirit of this organization. Now, another example I wanted to bring to your attention, because it's in the public domain, is Diplomatic Pulse. If you go to diplomaticpulse.org, you have access to a data set that we have been populating for the last years. It's a web scraper that scrapes press statements of all 193 member states, both their permanent missions, so their embassies to the United Nations, including their foreign ministries. And this gives you a quick idea of what the world thinks with regard to a certain issue. This is basically a Google for diplomats, and we started this as an endeavor to do the data collection and looking now at large language models, unpacking diplomatic language. Think about how the Security Council communicates, or the Secretary General, when the Secretary General is highly concerned about the situation in the Ukraine. The terminology highly, for instance, is an intensifier. Concerned would be an issue that would warrant attention. And I brought you here the example from February 2023, just a few weeks ago, a statement attributed to the Secretary General where you can unpack diplomatic signals in a press release. Here, the word Korea gives you a sense for location. Condemning, using certain verbs, give you a sense for stance. So that's a sentiment. And an intensifier when the Secretary General is strongly or highly or very concerned. So it gives you a greater sense for urgency. And then there's always a message in a press communication that asks for action, here calling on the DPRK to immediately desist from any other further actions. Now, I've explained this to you now here in a manual way. Imagine you could do this with a machine learning, where you can apply this to hundreds of thousands of statements from all member states to get a sense for trends and developments. And this is where machines can be very helpful to unpack diplomatic signals and give us basically developments and trends at scale. We can apply the same for radio and television mining. As mentioned, social media might be prominent in some parts of the world, and many places that we operate in, radio and television is king. I lived in the Middle East, and the best source for information was radio talk shows in the morning from 8 to 9. I would sit in the car in traffic and listen to what people say on the radio. And you can also mine that, because speech can be transcribed and then mined according to keywords or certain sentiments. And that, again, gives us an additional vector in the conversation for making sense of a situation on the ground, in comparison to just reading mainstream news or using our human intelligence network, of course, of analysts and sources that we have in conflict zones. Now, how do we use artificial intelligence to enhance inclusivity? The first examples I gave you was more on the analytical side. Now, let me draw to your attention a bit of what we do to engage with peace constituencies. And when you think about peace processes, here I took the example of the Libyan political dialogue process. You can fit only so many people into a room. Here in the context of Libya, it was around 75 delegates, vis-a-vis over 7 million people. And that's a true challenge for peace negotiations. And even in the context of Yemen, where the national dialogue had over 500 delegates, in comparison to over 30 million Yemenis, we see constraints when it comes to peace processes, either space, time, other resources. Now, what if you could combine the power of a poll, a survey, which usually means 1,000 people plus, right? When you conduct a survey, you can scout the public opinions of 1,000 people plus. If you could combine this with the intimacy of a focus group, and the beauty of a focus group is that you have a smaller group that listens to each other's answers and that can respond to the conversations. What if you could combine the power of a poll and the intimacy, the flexibility of a focus group? This is where artificial intelligence comes into the game. We teamed up with a private sector partner, the company is called Remesh, that helped us modify a tool that is used in the marketing field, basically a tool that is used in the private sector to scout sentiments with regard to products. What do people think in conflict zone or non-conflict zones on Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Nike, and so forth? And this tool has been repurposed for peace processes, where you can basically, in a text-based conversation, have a conversation with 1,000 people on an issue related to a peace process. And that gives us greater inclusivity and makes solutions eventually also more durable. Here, an example from Yemen. We started this during the pandemic. This is text-based, so it allows also the participants to stay fully anonymous. They would only reveal some demographic information about themselves, like age, gender, self-identified location, but they wouldn't appear with their picture. They wouldn't appear with their sound or any way that gives their identification away. So it creates a safe space for them. We had over hundreds of Yemenis participating in the first dialogue over 3 years ago, and we repeated this on various occasions. Here, the example of Libya, where the special envoy at the time engaged with the public at large. This dialogue was picked up by national television, and we had over 4 million people watching the dialogue, where we had over 2,000 youth from Libya having a conversation with the highest UN representative. That's facilitated through artificial intelligence that allows you to basically get a snapshot of those views on the spot. It uses machine learning for semantic similarities. So it clusters answers in a way where those answers are presented to you on a dashboard, so that as a participant, you see what 1,000 people say, you can respond to that in real time. While a poll, for instance, would at least take you 4 up to 6 weeks to get results, and it wouldn't be as interactive. So here, a good example, I think, of new technologies helping us to increase inclusivity in peace processes. We build solutions that work in conflict zones where it's already very hard to charge your phone, where individuals have to make a choice whether they want to engage with the UN or call their loved ones. So we build easy-to-use applications, again, with the aim to get citizens engaged, have their voices heard, and also particularly reach out to communities that are usually not part of formal peace negotiations. Now, the last point that I wanted to flag to you is the future of diplomacy. If virtual reality is already part of the UN's toolbox, if we already use satellites to predict water shortage, if we use machine learning to unpack social media signals, and we use artificial intelligence to have conversations in real time with 1,000 people plus in 2023, facilitated by the UN, how will the future of diplomacy look like? And let me just recall what Roy Amara said, who was a futurist in the United States, who made the following comment. And I'm going to unpack that with you in a second, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the Q&A session. He said that we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run, and we underestimate the effect in the long run. I think it means that we usually are rushing into a hype when we see a new type of technology. And then we quickly get disappointment because the human expectation is that this type of technology will gradually grow. The truth is that technology sees ups and downs, especially in the startup phase, where the ripeness is not there yet. Take the example of GPT-3, large language models that are now more sophisticatedly available for the mainstream population, where the AI might not give you the answers you might look for. There's a hype, we might see a disappointment, but the truth is that those technologies, those groundbreaking, innovative technologies are not going to go away. They're going to incrementally entrench our life and change the way of how we work and live. So again, we overestimate the impact at the beginning, then we see a down because we get disappointed, and then our perception is that there's not much worth in the technology, so that's why we underestimate the long-term trends. That's interesting. That's important when we think about the future. Just a few visuals here from our work that we started a few years ago at the mark of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The UN was not born yesterday, but has been in business since the end of the Second World War. And it's pretty hard, to be honest, to reimagine the United Nations. So if you think about the UN 50 years from now, will there be a role for technology, or will we stay away from tech because of the fears that we have encountered over the years? So those are all questions, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for your attention, and thanks so much for having me with you. Back to you.